202 BC, the plains of Zama in what is now modern Tunisia. Two armies faced each other in what would become one of the most decisive battles in human history. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general who had terrorized Rome for 16 years, the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants and crushed Roman legions at Cannae in a tactical masterpiece still studied in military academies today. On the other side stood Scipio Africanus, the young Roman general who had spent years learning from Hannibal's victories, adapting his tactics and preparing for this exact moment. But the outcome of this battle would not be decided by these two brilliant commanders alone. It would be determined by a single catastrophic betrayal: the Numidian Cavalry. The elite horsemen, who had been Carthage's most valuable allies for generations, switched sides at the critical moment. Their defection didn't just cost Carthage a battle, it ended an empire, sealed Hannibal's fate, and changed the course of Western civilization forever. This is the story of how the greatest cavalry force in the ancient world abandoned their longtime allies, and why their betrayal at Zama represents one of the most consequential military decisions ever made. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we need to understand who the Numidians were and why their cavalry was so feared. Numidia occupied the territory of modern Algeria and parts of Tunisia and Morocco. It was not a unified kingdom but rather a collection of tribes, the most powerful being the Masili in the east and the Masasili in the west. These were not primitive nomads. The Numidians had developed sophisticated political structures, controlled important trade routes, and accumulated substantial wealth from agriculture and commerce. But what made them legendary was their cavalry. The Numidian horsemen were born in the saddle. Boys learned to ride almost before they could walk. Their horses were small, fast, incredibly agile animals, bred specifically for the harsh North African terrain. Unlike Greek or Roman cavalry, who rode with saddles and bridles, Numidian riders controlled their mounts with voice commands and leg pressure alone. They carried light javelins, spears, and small shields. They wore minimal armor, prioritizing speed and maneuverability over protection. Their tactics were based on hit-and-run attacks, feigned retreats, and the ability to appear, strike, and vanish before heavier cavalry could respond. Ancient historians described Numidian cavalry as the finest light cavalry in the Mediterranean world. They could ride for days with minimal supplies. They could strike from unexpected angles, disrupt supply lines, and demoralize far larger forces through constant harassment. In battle, they operated in loose formations that could quickly disperse and reform, making them nearly impossible to pin down. When they charged, it was not in the solid wall of heavy cavalry, but in waves of riders who would throw their javelins, wheel away, and return for another pass. This made them perfect for flanking maneuvers, pursuit of broken enemies, and preventing enemy cavalry from protecting vulnerable infantry. Carthage had recognized the value of Numidian cavalry early. As a maritime trading empire, Carthage lacked the vast infantry resources of Rome. They relied heavily on mercenaries and allies to fill their armies. Numidian cavalry became an essential component of every Carthaginian army. In exchange for their service, Carthaginian generals paid well, provided a share of plunder, and maintained diplomatic relationships with Numidian chiefs. It was a practical alliance built on mutual benefit. Carthage needed cavalry. Numidia needed markets for their goods and protection from rivals. For generations, this arrangement worked perfectly. The relationship reached its peak during Hannibal's invasion of Italy. When Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BC, with his famous elephants, Numidian cavalry formed a crucial part of his army. These horsemen proved instrumental in Hannibal's greatest victories. At the Trebia River in 218 BC, Numidian cavalry helped lure the Roman consul into a trap. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, they prevented Roman forces from escaping the ambush. But it was at Cannae in 216 BC that Numidian cavalry demonstrated their true value in what became Hannibal's masterpiece of military annihilation. The Battle of Cannae is still studied today as perhaps the most perfect tactical victory in military history. Hannibal faced a Roman army of approximately 80,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever assembled. His own army numbered perhaps 50,000. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, advanced in their traditional formation, a massive block of heavy infantry designed to simply overwhelm opponents through sheer weight. Hannibal's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He arranged his infantry in a convex formation that bulged toward the Romans. As the Roman infantry pushed forward, Hannibal's centre gave ground gradually, forming a pocket that drew the Romans deeper. Meanwhile, his cavalry, including the Numidian horsemen, attacked the Roman cavalry on the wings. This is where the Numidians proved decisive. They engaged the Roman cavalry on the right wing, harassing and disrupting them with their hit-and-run tactics. On the left wing, Hannibal's heavier Spanish and Gallic cavalry crushed the Roman cavalry there and then wheeled around to attack the Roman cavalry on the right from behind. The Roman cavalry, already engaged with the Numidians, broke and fled. With the Roman cavalry driven off, the Numidian horsemen joined Hannibal's heavy cavalry in attacking the rear of the Roman infantry, who were still pushing forward into Hannibal's centre. The Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded. Hannibal's infantry on the wings closed in. The cavalry attacked from behind. The Romans were trapped in a killing box with no escape. What followed was a slaughter. Ancient sources claim that 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died that day. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history, and the Numidian cavalry had been essential to making it happen. For the next decade, Numidian cavalry continued to serve Hannibal as he campaigned through Italy. They raided Roman supply lines, prevented Roman armies from maneuvering freely, and maintained pressure on Roman forces. Rome learned to fear the sight of these swift horsemen appearing on the horizon, but alliances in the ancient world were never permanent. They were based on practical considerations of power, profit, and survival, and in Numidia itself, internal politics were about to reshape the entire strategic situation. The key figure in this story is Masinissa, one of the most remarkable leaders of the ancient world, and a man whose decisions would alter history. Born around 238 BC, Masinissa was the son of Gala, king of the Massili, the eastern Numidian tribe. From his youth, Masinissa was groomed for leadership and trained as a cavalry commander. He fought alongside Carthaginian forces in Spain during the Second Punic War, gaining valuable combat experience and establishing relationships with Carthaginian commanders. By all accounts, he was a brilliant cavalry leader, fearless in battle and politically astute. The Carthaginians valued him highly and supported his claim to leadership of the Massili tribe. But Numidian politics were complex and often violent. The western tribe, the Masaicili, was ruled by King Syphax, who initially allied with Carthage but later switched to supporting Rome. When Masinissa's father died around 206 BC, Syphax saw an opportunity. With Carthaginian forces focused on the war with Rome, Syphax invaded Massili territory and drove Masinissa into exile. Suddenly the young prince found himself without a kingdom, commanding only a small band of loyal followers. This personal catastrophe would ultimately lead to one of the most significant betrayals in ancient history. Enter Scipio Africanus. Born Publius Cornelius Scipio, this young Roman general was cut from different cloth than the typical Roman commander. Most Roman generals of the era relied on the traditional Roman strengths, discipline, heavy infantry, and attrition. Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics and recognized that Rome needed to adapt. After victories in Spain, where he defeated Carthaginian armies and captured their territories, Scipio was given command of Roman forces in Africa. His mission was to invade Carthaginian territory and force Hannibal to leave Italy to defend Carthage itself. Scipio understood something crucial. Rome's cavalry had always been inferior to Carthage's. At Cannae and every other battle, the Carthaginian cavalry superiority had been decisive. If Scipio was going to defeat Hannibal in Africa, he needed cavalry that could match the Numidians, and there was only one source for that cavalry: Numidians themselves. Scipio needed Masinissa. The meeting between Scipio and Masinissa probably occurred in 206 or 205 BC, though the exact details are debated by historians. What is clear is that Scipio made Masinissa an offer he couldn't refuse. If Masinissa allied with Rome and brought his cavalry to fight against Carthage, Scipio would support Masinissa's claim to rule not just the Massili, but all of Numidia. Scipio would help Masinissa defeat Syphax and the Masaicili. Masinissa would become king of a united Numidian kingdom under Roman protection. In exchange, Masinissa's cavalry would fight for Rome against Carthage. For Masinissa, this was an agonizing decision. He had fought alongside Carthaginian commanders for years. His family had maintained alliances with Carthage for generations. Carthaginian traders had enriched Numidian cities, But Masinissa was also a realist. Carthage was losing the war. Hannibal, despite his tactical genius, had failed to break Rome. He had won every battle but was losing the war. Rome's advantage lay in its vast manpower reserves and its ability to absorb horrific losses and continue fighting. Carthage, relying on mercenaries and allies, could not sustain such losses. Masinissa could see which way the wind was blowing. More immediately, allying with Scipio offered him something Carthage could not deliver anymore: the military support to reclaim his kingdom and unite Numidia under his rule. Syphax controlled Numidian territory and had allied with Rome initially, though he would later switch back to Carthage. Masinissa needed powerful allies to defeat Syphax. Carthage, preoccupied with Rome, could not provide that support. Rome could. Masinissa made his choice. He would betray Carthage and ally with Rome. It was one of the most consequential decisions in ancient history. The immediate effect was dramatic. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in Africa with his army. Masinissa joined him with several thousand Numidian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the world. Scipio now had the cavalry army needed. Together they began campaigning against Carthaginian territory. The first major engagement came in 203 BC, when Scipio and Masinissa attacked the camps of Syphax and his Carthaginian ally Hasdrubal Gisco. Using night attacks and coordination between Roman infantry and Numidian cavalry, they destroyed both armies. Syphax was captured. Masinissa claimed his former enemy's kingdom. Within a year, Masinissa ruled a united Numidia as Scipio had promised. The alliance had delivered exactly what Masinissa wanted. But the war was not over. Carthage, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy. Hannibal had not set foot in Africa for 36 years. He had left as a young man accompanying his father's army. He returned as a legendary general who had never lost a battle against Rome. But he returned to a changed situation. Carthage's resources were depleted. Their armies had been defeated multiple times by Scipio, and most critically, they had lost their Numidian cavalry. Masinissa, who should have been fighting for Carthage, was now fighting for Rome. Nevertheless, Hannibal set about raising a new army. He gathered what troops Carthage could muster, hired mercenaries, and prepared to face Scipio in a final confrontation. The two armies met at Zama in October of 202 BC. The exact location is debated, but it was somewhere southwest of Carthage in the plains where cavalry could operate effectively. Hannibal commanded approximately 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. He also had 80 war elephants, a formidable if unpredictable weapon. Scipio commanded a similar number of infantry, perhaps 29,000 Romans and Italian allies, plus several thousand Numidian infantry. But in cavalry, Scipio had a decisive advantage. Masinissa brought 6,000 Numidian cavalry. Additional Numidian forces under another prince, Decamus, brought the total allied cavalry to around 10,000. Scipio's cavalry outnumbered Hannibal's by more than 2 to 1. Hannibal knew he faced a problem. His cavalry was inferior in both quality and quantity. At Cannae, his superior cavalry had been the key to victory. Now the situation was reversed. Hannibal's plan at Zama reflected this reality. He would use his elephants to disrupt the Roman infantry and hopefully cause panic. His infantry, including veterans who had fought with him in Italy, would engage the Roman centre. Meanwhile, his cavalry would try to tie up Scipio's superior horsemen, long enough for the infantry battle to be decided. It was not a plan designed for decisive victory, but for survival, and perhaps a narrow win. He no longer had the tools to create another Cannae. Scipio's plan was simpler and more aggressive. He arranged his infantry in an unusual formation with gaps between the maniples, the standard Roman tactical units, so the elephants would charge through the lanes without disrupting his formations. His cavalry would be on the wings, Numidian light cavalry on one wing, and Roman and Italian heavy cavalry supported by more Numidians on the other. The plan was to drive off Hannibal's cavalry, then have the victorious Roman and Numidian horsemen return to attack Hannibal's infantry from behind. In other words, Scipio planned to do to Hannibal exactly what Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae. And the key to this plan was the Numidian cavalry, the same cavalry that had once fought for Carthage, now fighting for Rome. The battle began with the elephant charge. Hannibal sent his 80 war elephants forward toward the Roman lines. But Scipio had prepared for this. Roman trumpets and horns blared, creating a terrifying noise that panicked many of the elephants. Some charged through the gaps in the Roman formation, causing minimal damage. Others, maddened by the noise, turned and ran back into Hannibal's own cavalry lines, creating chaos. The elephant charge, which Hannibal had hoped would disrupt the Romans, instead disrupted his own forces. With the elephants gone, the cavalry battle began. On both wings, the Numidian cavalry charged, but the numbers were overwhelmingly against Hannibal's horsemen. Masinissa's Numidians, men who had once fought alongside Carthaginian armies, now attacked their former allies with ferocity. They knew Carthaginian cavalry tactics intimately because they had invented many of them. They knew every trick, every feint, every maneuver. The Carthaginian cavalry, outnumbered and outmatched, was driven from the field. Some sources suggest they did not even seriously contest the battle, knowing defeat was inevitable. The Roman and Italian cavalry under Laelius, Scipio's second in command, joined the pursuit, driving the defeated Carthaginian horsemen away from the battlefield. Now the infantry battle began in earnest. Hannibal's first line, made up of mercenaries and less experienced troops, advanced toward the Roman lines. The fighting was brutal. These were not the veteran Italian legions Hannibal had faced at Cannae. These were soldiers who had trained under Scipio, who had learned from Hannibal's tactics, who understood combined arms warfare. The Carthaginian first line was pushed back. Hannibal's second line, rather than supporting the first, refused to let them retreat through their ranks. The first-line troops, betrayed by their own comrades, were cut down between the lines. It was a desperate move by Hannibal, sacrificing his own men to preserve his veteran corps. The battle devolved into a grinding infantry struggle. Hannibal's veterans, men who had fought through the Italian campaign, held their ground. The Romans, despite their numbers, could not break through. For a time, the outcome hung in balance. This was the moment when, at Cannae, the Roman infantry had found themselves surrounded and destroyed. But Zama was not Cannae. At Cannae, the Carthaginian cavalry had swept away the Roman horsemen and returned to attack from behind. At Zama, it was Roman and Numidian cavalry that returned from pursuit. Masinissa and Laelius, having driven off the Carthaginian cavalry, wheeled their forces around and charged into the rear of Hannibal's infantry. The veterans, still fighting desperately against Scipio's infantry to their front, suddenly faced cavalry attack from behind. The Numidian horsemen, the same men who had made Cannae possible for Hannibal 16 years earlier, now made Zama possible for Scipio. They crashed into the rear ranks, throwing javelins, cutting down men who couldn't defend against attacks from both directions. The Carthaginian formation, already strained, collapsed. What followed was a slaughter. Ancient sources claim that 20,000 Carthaginians died compared to perhaps 2,000 Romans. Hannibal himself barely escaped the battlefield. The Battle of Zama was over. Carthage had lost, and the decisive factor had been the cavalry, specifically the Numidian cavalry, fighting for Rome instead of Carthage. If Masinissa had brought his 6,000 horsemen to fight for Hannibal instead of against him, the battle would have played out very differently. Hannibal would have had cavalry superiority. He might have been able to recreate the tactics that worked at Cannae. Scipio's infantry might have found themselves surrounded and destroyed. The war might have continued, history might have unfolded on an entirely different path, but that is not what happened. Masinissa chose Rome, the Numidian cavalry fought for Scipio, and Hannibal, the greatest tactical general of the ancient world, was defeated by his own tactics, executed by his former allies. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage lost all territory outside Africa. They were forced to surrender their navy, keeping only 10 ships. They had to pay an enormous indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years. They were forbidden from waging war without Roman permission. In one battle, the Carthaginian Empire effectively ended. Rome became the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Hannibal, who had terrorized Rome for 16 years, was reduced to a statesman trying to rebuild a shattered city. He would eventually flee Carthage to escape Roman vengeance and die in exile. For Masinissa, the rewards were everything he had been promised and more. He ruled a united Numidia as a Roman client king for 54 years, dying at age 90. Under his rule, Numidia prospered enormously. He introduced advanced agriculture, built cities, developed trade networks, and transformed Numidia from a collection of tribes into a wealthy kingdom. He remained a loyal Roman ally throughout his life. When Carthage attempted to resist Numidian encroachment on their territory decades later, Rome sided with Masinissa. This conflict ultimately led to the Third Punic War, in which Rome completely destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, burning the city and enslaving its population. From a purely pragmatic perspective, Masinissa's betrayal was brilliant. He assessed the strategic situation correctly. Rome was going to win the Second Punic War. Carthage was exhausted. By switching sides at the critical moment, Masinissa positioned himself and his people on the winning side. He gained a kingdom, wealth, security, and a legacy as one of the great rulers of North Africa. His descendants ruled Numidia until it was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The Numidian Cavalry became Rome's most valued auxiliary troops, serving in campaigns across the empire. Numidian horsemen fought in Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and the East. They remained the finest light cavalry in the Roman military for centuries. But the betrayal at Zama represents something larger than one man's political calculation. It demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of any empire that relies on allies and mercenaries rather than citizen armies. Carthage's military system was based on hiring soldiers and maintaining alliances with client states. When those allies decided their interests lay elsewhere, Carthage had no fallback. Rome, by contrast, built its military power on Roman and Italian citizens who had a direct stake in Rome's survival. When Rome lost battles, even catastrophic defeats like Cannae, they could raise new armies from their vast manpower reserves. Carthage could not. The betrayal also reveals the personal nature of ancient alliances. Modern nations make treaties and alliances based on national interests, formalized in documents and institutions. Ancient alliances were personal relationships between leaders. When Masinissa chose to ally with Scipio rather than remain loyal to Carthage, he was making a personal decision based on his assessment of who could help him achieve his goals. There was no Numidian Senate debating the matter, no constitutional process. Masinissa decided, and the Numidian Cavalry followed. The fate of empires hung on such personal choices. The military implications were profound and immediate. Zama proved that Hannibal's tactics, brilliant as they were, could be turned against Carthage when Rome secured cavalry superiority. Scipio had learned from his enemy, adapted those lessons, and executed them with the same cavalry forces that had made Hannibal's victories possible. It was a complete reversal. The student had become the master, the weapon had changed hands, and the result was the end of Carthaginian power. One cannot help but wonder what Hannibal felt as he watched Numidian cavalry, the horsemen who had been instrumental in his greatest victories, charging into his army at Zama. He knew these men. He had fought alongside them for years in Italy. He knew their tactics, their capabilities, their value. Now they were killing his soldiers. Ancient sources don't record Hannibal's emotional state during the battle, but it must have been devastating to see his own tactics used against him by men who had once been his allies. After Zama, Hannibal remained in Carthage for several years, serving as a suffet, essentially a chief magistrate, and working to reform Carthage's government and economy to help pay the Roman indemnity. But his presence made Rome nervous. They demanded he be handed over. Rather than face Roman captivity, Hannibal fled in 195 BC, beginning a long exile that took him to the eastern Mediterranean. He served various kings as a military advisor, always staying one step ahead of Roman pursuit. He finally died in Bithynia around 183 BC, either by poison to avoid capture or possibly by his own hand. The man who had nearly destroyed Rome died in exile, his empire gone, his life's work undone in large part because the cavalry he had relied upon switched sides. Masinissa, meanwhile, lived to be 90 years old, ruling Numidia until 148 BC. He had numerous sons, sired his last children when he was well into his 80s, and built a kingdom that survived him by several generations. When he died, Roman sources recorded that he was still physically vigorous, mentally sharp, and actively ruling. His legacy in North Africa was profound. The cities he built, the agricultural systems he established, and the political structures he created shaped the region for centuries. But his historical legacy is more ambiguous. To Romans and their historians, he was a wise ally who made the right choice. To those who valued loyalty and traditional alliances, he was a traitor who abandoned his people's longtime allies at the critical moment for personal gain. The Numidian Cavalry themselves continued to serve Rome for centuries after Zama. They became a standard component of Roman armies, valued for exactly the same qualities that had made them valuable to Carthage: speed, mobility, tactical flexibility, and devastating effectiveness in pursuit and harassment. Roman generals deployed Numidian cavalry in virtually every major campaign. When Julius Caesar fought in Gaul, and later in the civil wars, Numidian cavalry rode with his armies. When Trajan and other emperors campaigned in the east, Numidian horsemen were there. The irony is profound. The cavalry that had nearly enabled Hannibal to destroy Rome became one of Rome's most reliable military assets. The question of whether Masinissa's betrayal was justified depends entirely on perspective. From a Numidian perspective, he transformed his people from tribal confederations into a powerful unified kingdom. He brought prosperity, stability, and international prestige. His long rule was remembered as a golden age in Numidian history. From a Carthaginian perspective, he was a traitor who abandoned allies in their moment of greatest need, directly causing their defeat and eventual destruction. From a Roman perspective, he was a wise leader who recognized reality and positioned his people on the right side of history. From a purely military perspective, his decision to bring the finest cavalry in the Mediterranean to Scipio's side was the single most important factor in Rome's victory at Zama. Modern historians have debated Masinissa's decision for centuries. Some argue he had no real choice, that Carthage was clearly losing, and allying with Rome was the only way to preserve Numidian independence. Others argue that he could have negotiated better terms with Carthage or remained neutral. Still others point out that his decision was primarily driven by personal ambition, his desire to unite Numidia under his rule, and that he would have allied with whoever could help him achieve that goal. All of these perspectives contain truth. Masinissa was responding to strategic realities, but he was also pursuing personal ambitions. He saved his people from being on the losing side of history, but he did so by betraying longtime allies. What is undeniable is the magnitude of the consequences. The Battle of Zama decided the Second Punic War. That war determined whether Rome or Carthage would dominate the Western Mediterranean. That domination ultimately led to Roman control of the entire Mediterranean basin and the creation of an empire that shaped Western civilization. The language we speak, the legal systems we use, the political concepts we hold, the literature we read, all of these were shaped by Roman civilization, and Roman civilization achieved its dominant position in large part because of what happened at Zama. If Masinissa had fought for Hannibal instead of Scipio, Roman civilization might have been stillborn. Western history would have unfolded along entirely different lines. The world we live in today might be unrecognizably different. The betrayal at Zama also established a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Cavalry forces, because of their mobility and tactical importance, often held disproportionate power in determining battle outcomes. The side that could secure superior cavalry often won, regardless of infantry numbers. This remained true through the medieval period when knights dominated European warfare, through the age of gunpowder when cavalry charges could still decide battles, and even into the early 20th century when cavalry reconnaissance shaped operational planning. The principle Scipio learned at Zama, secure cavalry superiority and use it to envelope the enemy, remained valid for over 2,000 years. The personal relationship between Scipio and Masinissa also deserves attention. Ancient sources suggest they genuinely respected each other. They had met when both were young men, recognized each other's qualities, and formed an alliance that went beyond mere political calculation. After Zama, they remained in contact. When Scipio faced political attacks in Rome from jealous rivals, Masinissa sent gifts and letters of support. When Masinissa faced challenges in Numidia, Scipio used his influence to support him. It was an alliance between individuals that shaped the destiny of nations. The Battle of Zama itself has been analysed by military historians for over 2,000 years. It appears in every serious study of ancient warfare. Modern military academies still teach it as an example of how to defeat a superior tactical commander through strategic preparation, specifically by securing advantages in the areas where your enemy has traditionally been strongest. Scipio defeated Hannibal by becoming better at Hannibal's own game. He secured cavalry superiority, the foundation of Hannibal's earlier victories. He adapted flexible tactics, another Hannibal trademark. He used combined arms coordination, infantry and cavalry working together, exactly as Hannibal had done. Then he executed a double envelopment, the same tactic Hannibal had used at Cannae. The student had not just learned from the master, but surpassed him by using the master's own tools. The human dimension of the betrayal resonates across centuries. Somewhere on that battlefield at Zama, Numidian cavalrymen who had once fought for Carthage charged into the ranks of Carthaginian soldiers. Perhaps some of them had personal relationships with the men they were now killing. Perhaps some felt guilt or conflict about what they were doing. Or perhaps they simply followed their king's orders, as soldiers do, without questioning the larger strategic implications. We will never know their individual thoughts and feelings, but their collective action changed the world. In the years after Zama, as Carthage struggled under the weight of the Roman indemnity and the restrictions placed on them, Masinissa systematically encroached on Carthaginian territory. He would seize land, Carthage would protest to Rome, and Rome would side with their ally Masinissa. This went on for decades, gradually reducing Carthaginian territory to just the city and its immediate surroundings. Each time Carthage tried to resist militarily, they violated the peace treaty's provision that they could not wage war without Roman permission. This gave Rome the pretext they needed. In 149 BC, Rome demanded that Carthage abandon their city and relocate 10 miles inland. When Carthage refused, Rome besieged the city. After 3 years of desperate resistance, Carthage fell in 146 BC. The city was burned, the population enslaved, and the territory became the Roman province of Africa. Masinissa died 2 years before seeing this final destruction, but his policies and his alliance with Rome had made it inevitable. The complete destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War might seem like vindictive overkill by Rome, but it reflected the deep trauma that Hannibal's invasion had inflicted on the Roman psyche. For 16 years, Hannibal had ravaged Italy. He had destroyed Roman armies, killed hundreds of thousands of Romans and allies, and threatened Rome's very existence. That trauma never healed. Even 50 years later, Roman leaders like Cato the Elder insisted that Carthage must be destroyed. The phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became his catchphrase. Rome would not feel safe until Carthage ceased to exist, and Masinissa's betrayal at Zama, while it ended the immediate threat, did not erase Roman memories of how close they had come to annihilation. From the Numidian perspective, the period after Zama represented their golden age. Masinissa transformed Numidia from a tribal society into an urbanized kingdom with sophisticated agriculture, thriving trade, and impressive architecture. He introduced the cultivation of grain on a massive scale, making Numidia one of the breadbaskets of the Mediterranean. He built cities that featured Roman-style amenities, baths, theatres, forums, but retained distinctly African characteristics. He created a hybrid culture that blended indigenous Berber traditions with Carthaginian and Roman influences. His kingdom was wealthy, stable, and respected. When he died in 148 BC, he left behind a legacy that few rulers of his era could match. But the Numidian Golden Age did not last. Masinissa's sons and grandsons fought over the succession, splitting the kingdom. Rome intervened repeatedly, supporting some claimants against others, gradually asserting more control. By 46 BC, Julius Caesar had converted Numidia into a Roman province. The independent kingdom that Masinissa had built lasted less than a century after his death. The cavalry that had turned the tide at Zama became just another auxiliary unit in the Roman military machine. The irony is striking. Masinissa had betrayed Carthage to ally with Rome, transforming Numidia into a powerful kingdom. But within a century, that kingdom was absorbed into the very empire he had helped create. His descendants became Roman administrators, his people Roman subjects. The independence he fought for proved temporary. This raises perhaps the ultimate question about the betrayal at Zama. Was it worth it? From the perspective of Numidia's immediate interests in 202 BC, absolutely. Masinissa gained everything he wanted. But from the perspective of long-term Numidian independence, the results are more ambiguous. By tying Numidia so closely to Rome, by becoming a Roman client state, Numidia eventually lost the very independence Masinissa had fought to secure. Perhaps if Hannibal had won at Zama, if Carthage had remained strong, the balance of power in North Africa might have preserved Numidian independence longer. Or perhaps Carthaginian victory would have led to Carthaginian domination of Numidia, We can only speculate. What we can say with certainty is that the betrayal at Zama was one of the genuine turning points in human history. It decided the Second Punic War. That war decided the fate of the Western Mediterranean. That decision ultimately led to Roman domination of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Roman civilization shaped Western civilization in fundamental ways. Our languages, our laws, our political systems, our literature, our architecture, all bear the marks of Roman influence. And Rome's rise to dominance required the defeat of Carthage. That defeat occurred at Zama, and Zama was decided by Numidian cavalry fighting for Rome instead of Carthage. In the end, the story of the Numidian betrayal at Zama is a story about the personal nature of ancient politics, the decisive importance of cavalry in ancient warfare, the vulnerability of empires built on alliances rather than citizen armies, and the way individual decisions by leaders like Masinissa can reshape the course of human history. It is a story about loyalty and betrayal, about practical calculation versus traditional obligations, about the way military force and political power intersect. It is a story that has echoed through history, studied by generals and statesmen, analysed by historians, and remembered as one of the moments when the world changed direction. When those Numidian cavalrymen charged into the rear of Hannibal's army at Zama, they were not thinking about Western civilization or the course of history. They were following their king's orders, fighting for their own interests, pursuing victory in battle. But their charge ended an empire, defeated the greatest general of the age, and set Rome on the path to dominating the known world. The thunder of their horses' hooves that day at Zama echoed down through the centuries, shaping the world we live in today. And it all happened because one man, Masinissa, decided that his future, and his people's future, lay with Rome rather than Carthage. The consequences of that decision are still with us, over 2,200 years later. The aftermath of Zama reverberated through the ancient world in ways that extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. For Hannibal personally, the defeat marked the beginning of a long and tragic decline that would end in exile and death. After the battle, he returned to Carthage and advised the Senate to accept Rome's peace terms. When some Carthaginian senators argued for continuing the war, Hannibal reportedly told them bluntly that they had no idea what war truly was, having never left their comfortable city while he had spent 36 years campaigning. His authority carried the day. Carthage accepted the peace. For the next few years, Hannibal served as suffet, one of Carthage's chief magistrates, a civilian role far removed from the military glory he had known. He threw himself into reforming Carthage's government and economy, with the same energy he had once devoted to military campaigns. He investigated corruption, reformed the tax system, and reorganized Carthaginian finances to ensure they could pay the massive Roman indemnity without destroying their economy. He was apparently as brilliant in administration as he had been in warfare. But his presence in Carthage made Rome increasingly nervous. The Roman Senate, still traumatized by the years of terror Hannibal had inflicted on Italy, could not tolerate his continued influence in Carthage. They pressured the Carthaginian government to hand him over. In 195 BC, warned that arrest was imminent, Hannibal fled Carthage by night. He was 47 years old, and he would never see his homeland again. He made his way to the eastern Mediterranean, offering his services to various kings and rulers who opposed Rome. He advised Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, one of the great Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander the Great's empire, encouraging him to invade Italy as Hannibal had done. But Antiochus was no Hannibal. When he did fight Rome, he was decisively defeated at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. The peace treaty that followed included a provision demanding that Hannibal be handed over to Rome. Once again, Hannibal fled. He moved from court to court, never staying long enough for Roman agents to capture him. He went to Crete, then to Armenia, then to Bithynia in northwestern Anatolia, modern Turkey, where King Prusias gave him refuge. Even there, Rome pursued him. In 183 or 182 BC, Roman agents closed in on Hannibal's location. Rather than face capture and certain execution, Hannibal took poison. According to the Roman historian Livy, his last words were a bitter commentary on Roman persistence. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. Thus died the greatest enemy Rome ever faced, alone in a foreign land, brought down not by defeat in battle, but by relentless Roman vindictiveness, and ultimately by the betrayal that had cost him victory at Zama. The contrast with Masinissa's fate could not be more striking. While Hannibal died in exile, Masinissa ruled Numidia for 54 years, dying peacefully in his bed at age 90. Ancient sources describe him as maintaining remarkable physical and mental vigour into extreme old age. Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, recorded that Masinissa was still leading troops in battle at age 86, that he could stand for hours without leaning on anything, and that he fathered children when he was well over 80. Whether all these details are literally true or represent the kind of exaggeration that often surrounds legendary figures, they reflect the genuine respect and awe that Masinissa commanded. His reign transformed Numidia fundamentally. When he came to power, Numidia was a collection of semi-nomadic tribes with limited urbanization and relatively simple political structures. When he died, Numidia had become a wealthy kingdom with thriving cities, sophisticated agriculture, and international trade networks. Masinissa understood that to maintain independence and prosperity as a Roman client, Numidia needed economic strength. He encouraged the cultivation of grain, making Numidia one of the major grain exporters of the Mediterranean. He built new cities and expanded existing ones. He promoted learning and brought in Greek intellectuals to his court. He created a coinage system that facilitated trade. Under his rule, Numidia punched far above its weight in the Mediterranean world. But his relationship with Carthage remained hostile throughout his life. Systematically, year after year, Masinissa encroached on Carthaginian territory. He would seize land, claiming it had historically belonged to Numidia. Carthage would protest to Rome, as the peace treaty required them to do. Roman arbitrators would arrive, hear both sides, and almost invariably rule in Masinissa's favour. It was a slow strangulation of Carthaginian power. By the 150s BC, Carthage had been reduced from a maritime empire to little more than a single wealthy city. Each Numidian encroachment reminded Carthage of what they had lost at Zama. Each Roman ruling in Masinissa's favour drove home the reality that Rome controlled their fate, and each acre of land transferred to Numidia was a direct result of Masinissa's decision to betray Carthage at that crucial moment in 202 BC. The psychological impact on Carthage must have been immense. They could see their former allies, the Numidians, gradually consuming their territory with Roman approval. They could do nothing about it. The peace treaty prohibited them from waging war without Roman permission. When they asked for that permission to defend themselves against Masinissa, Rome refused. When they defended themselves anyway in 150 BC, Rome used this as the pretext to demand Carthage's destruction. It was a no-win situation, and it had its roots in the events of Zama nearly 50 years earlier. The Third Punic War that destroyed Carthage in 146 BC was in many ways the final echo of Zama. Rome's stated reason for the war was that Carthage had violated the peace treaty by raising an army against Masinissa without permission, but the real reason was deeper. Rome had never forgotten Hannibal's invasion. Roman senators had grown up hearing stories of the terror years when Hannibal roamed Italy destroying armies. Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, gave voice to a widespread Roman sentiment. As long as Carthage existed, even as a shadow of its former self, some Romans could not feel secure. The final war was as much about Roman trauma as it was about contemporary politics. Masinissa died in 148 BC, 2 years before Carthage fell. He was 90 years old and had ruled Numidia longer than most people in the ancient world lived. His death created immediate problems. He had many sons from multiple wives, and he had not clearly designated a successor. Different factions supported different sons. The kingdom he had worked so hard to build and unify threatened to fracture. Rome intervened, sending Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, to settle the succession. Scipio Aemilianus divided the kingdom among Masinissa's 3 most prominent sons. This seemed like a reasonable compromise, but it set a precedent. Rome would henceforth decide Numidian succession disputes. Roman influence over Numidia, already strong, became dominant. Over the following decades, Numidia gradually lost its independence. The sons of Masinissa competed with each other, and with their own sons for power. Rome intervened repeatedly, always supporting claimants who were most loyal to Roman interests. The kingdom was divided and reunified multiple times as Roman policy shifted. When Jugurtha, one of Masinissa's grandsons, attempted to reunify Numidia by force and resist Roman interference in the 110s BC, Rome went to war. The Jugurthine War, as it came to be called, lasted from 112 to 106 BC and ended with Jugurtha's capture and execution. Rome installed a compliant king and effectively controlled Numidian policy from then on. By the time of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Africa during the Roman Civil War in 46 BC, Numidia was a Roman client state in all but name. Caesar, after defeating his opponents, formally annexed Numidia as the Roman province of Africa Nova. The independent kingdom that Masinissa had built was gone, absorbed into the Roman Empire just 156 years after Zama. The cavalry that had turned the tide of that battle became simply one more contingent in the vast Roman military machine. Numidian horsemen served Rome loyally for centuries, fighting in Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Syria, and wherever else Rome sent them. But they fought as auxiliaries in a Roman army, not as independent allies. The Numidian kingdom was gone. This raises an important historical question. Did Masinissa's betrayal ultimately benefit Numidia or harm it? In the short term, absolutely it benefited his people. Masinissa gained a kingdom, wealth, prestige, and a 54-year reign of prosperity and relative peace. His people enjoyed stability and economic growth under his rule. They were on the winning side of history. But in the long term, by tying Numidia so closely to Rome, by becoming so dependent on Roman support and approval, Masinissa made Numidian independence unsustainable. Without a strong Carthage to balance Roman power in North Africa, nothing could prevent Rome from eventually absorbing Numidia. Perhaps this was inevitable regardless of what Masinissa did. Rome was simply too powerful, too relentless, and too determined to control the Mediterranean. But one can argue that Masinissa's betrayal accelerated the process. Alternatively, one could argue that if Masinissa had remained loyal to Carthage and Hannibal had won at Zama, the outcome for Numidia might have been worse. A victorious Carthage, having defeated Rome, might have dominated North Africa even more completely than Rome eventually did. Carthage might have absorbed Numidia entirely, rather than allowing it even client kingdom status. Hannibal, despite his brilliance, was fighting for an empire that relied on controlling others. There is no reason to believe Carthage would have been a gentler master than Rome proved to be. From this perspective, Masinissa made the best choice available to him given the circumstances. He chose the side that would win and secured the best terms he could for his people. That those terms eventually led to Roman annexation does not necessarily mean he made the wrong choice. It might simply reflect the reality that no small kingdom could maintain independence indefinitely in a world dominated by expanding empires. The military lessons of Zama, meanwhile, reverberated through ancient and medieval military thinking for centuries. The battle became a standard example taught to commanders of how decisive cavalry superiority could be. Roman military writers analysed it extensively. Polybius, the Greek historian who was close to Scipio Aemilianus and had access to Roman archives, wrote a detailed account of the battle that emphasised how Scipio had learned from Hannibal and turned the master's tactics against him. Later Roman military theorists like Vegetius referenced Zama as an example of proper combined arms tactics. The principle that controlling the cavalry battle often decided the infantry engagement became a fundamental tenet of ancient warfare. Medieval military thinkers also studied Zama, though their understanding of it was sometimes filtered through imperfect sources and their own contemporary military concerns. The idea of heavy cavalry delivering the decisive blow in battle dominated medieval European warfare for centuries. While medieval knights were very different from Numidian-like cavalry in equipment and tactics, the underlying principle remained the same. Control the mounted arm, use it to envelop the enemy infantry, and achieve decisive victory. Battles like Hastings in 1066, where Norman cavalry played a crucial role in defeating the Saxon infantry, or Arsuf in 1191, where Richard the Lionheart's cavalry charge broke Saladin's forces, reflected lessons that traced back through centuries to engagements like Zama. The betrayal aspect of Zama also entered military and political consciousness, as an example of how alliances could shift and determine outcomes. Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, referenced the instability of mercenary and auxiliary forces as a fundamental problem in warfare. Though he did not cite Zama specifically, his arguments reflected the Carthaginian experience. Relying on forces you do not directly control, whether mercenaries, allies, or auxiliaries, creates vulnerability. Those forces may switch sides, may not fight with full commitment, or may simply be unavailable when you need them most. Rome's reliance on citizen legions, Machiavelli argued, was one reason for their success. They controlled their own military forces directly. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries and allies like the Numidians was a strategic weakness that Hannibal's tactical genius could not overcome. The personal story of the relationship between Scipio and Masinissa also became legendary. Ancient sources, particularly Livy and Polybius, portrayed it as a model of friendship between a Roman commander and a foreign ally. They reportedly met when both were young men, before Scipio's rise to prominence and before Masinissa reclaimed his kingdom. According to these accounts, they recognized each other's qualities immediately and formed a bond based on mutual respect. This personal relationship facilitated the military alliance that proved decisive at Zama. After the war, they maintained contact. When Scipio faced political troubles in Rome, accused of corruption by jealous rivals, Masinissa sent letters and gifts supporting his friend. When Masinissa faced challenges in Numidia, Scipio used his influence to assist. It was portrayed as a friendship that transcended political calculation, though of course political calculation was very much present throughout. This narrative of noble friendship between Roman commander and foreign ally became a template that Rome would use repeatedly. Roman generals cultivating relationships with foreign leaders, presenting these relationships as based on mutual respect and friendship, while actually serving Roman strategic interests, became standard practice. From Pompey's relationships with Eastern client kings, to Caesar's alliances with Gallic chieftains, to later imperial relationships with Germanic and other tribal leaders, Rome consistently used the model established by Scipio and Masinissa, present the relationship as friendship between equals while actually creating dependency. The foreign leader gained Roman support for their personal power. Rome gained a loyal client who would support Roman interests. Both sides benefited, but Rome benefited more, gradually extending its control until the client's independence became nominal and then vanished entirely. The 8 decades between Zama in 200 BC and the final destruction of Carthage in 146 BC demonstrated this process clearly. During this period, Carthage was theoretically independent. They governed their city, conducted trade, maintained their identity, but in practice they were a Roman client. They could not wage war without permission. They had to accept Roman arbitration in disputes with Numidia. They paid tribute to Rome, and when Rome finally decided Carthage should be destroyed, Carthage could not effectively resist. The peace treaty signed after Zama had locked Carthage into a subordinate position from which there was no escape. Masinissa's betrayal had not just decided a battle, it had eliminated the only power in the Western Mediterranean that could potentially check Roman expansion. With Carthage defeated, Rome had no rivals in the West. This allowed Rome to turn its attention eastward. The wars against the Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and eventually Egypt, proceeded in part because Rome did not need to worry about its western flank. If Carthage had remained strong, if Hannibal had won at Zama, Rome would have faced threats on multiple fronts. But with Carthage neutralized, Rome could concentrate its forces wherever needed. The conquest of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and eventually Egypt, all of which occurred in the 150 years after Zama, was made possible because Rome did not face any credible Western threat. Masinissa's cavalry charge at Zama had made this possible. The cultural impact of Rome's victory at Zama and subsequent dominance of the Mediterranean shaped Western civilization in ways that are still visible today. Latin, the language of Rome, became the foundation for the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. It influenced Germanic languages, including English. Legal systems throughout the Western world trace their roots to Roman law. Political concepts like republicanism, citizenship, and constitutional government were shaped by Roman models. Architecture, literature, philosophy, religion, all were filtered through the Roman experience. Christianity, which would become the dominant religion of Europe, spread initially through Roman infrastructure, the roads, cities, and administrative networks that Rome built across its empire. None of this was inevitable. If Hannibal had won at Zama, if Carthage had remained the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, history would have unfolded very differently. Carthaginian civilization was also sophisticated, with its own literature, philosophy, religious traditions, and cultural achievements. Most of it was lost when Rome destroyed Carthage so thoroughly that almost nothing survived. We know Carthage primarily through Roman sources, which is like understanding the United States solely through Soviet sources. The perspective is inevitably skewed. But we know enough to recognize that Carthaginian civilization was different from Roman civilization in important ways. A world dominated by Carthage rather than Rome would have been a different world. The betrayal at Zama ensured we live in a Roman world, not a Carthaginian one. The military evolution that continued after Zama also reflected lessons learned from the battle. Rome increasingly relied on auxiliary cavalry drawn from client peoples and allied tribes. The Roman legion remained the foundation of military power, heavy infantry that could hold ground and win battles through discipline and staying power. But Rome recognized that legions needed cavalry support, both for reconnaissance and for delivering the decisive blow in battle. Numidian cavalry, now fighting for Rome rather than against it, became the model for Roman auxiliary cavalry. Later, other peoples provided cavalry: Germans, Gauls, Thracians, Syrians, each with their own tactical styles. But the pattern established at Zama, with Rome securing cavalry superiority through alliances and then using that superiority to achieve victory, continued for centuries. The personal fate of the major figures at Zama illustrates the divergent paths of victor and vanquished. Scipio Africanus, after his triumph at Zama, returned to Rome as a hero. He celebrated a magnificent triumph, the Roman ceremony for victorious generals, parading captured Carthaginian soldiers and treasures through the streets, while the entire city celebrated. He was elected consul again and wielded enormous influence. But Roman politics was vicious, and success bred jealousy. Political enemies, particularly Cato the Elder, accused Scipio of corruption, of keeping plunder that should have gone to the state. The details of these accusations are murky, lost in the partisan accounts that survive. What is clear is that Scipio, disgusted by the attacks after everything he had done for Rome, withdrew from public life. He retired to his estate at Liternum in southern Italy and died there in 183 BC, the same year as Hannibal, both men ultimately brought down by the politics they never fully mastered despite their military genius. Scipio Africanus and Hannibal, the two greatest generals of their age, dying in the same year feels almost poetic. They were forever linked by their encounters, shaped by each other, defined by their rivalry. Scipio had learned from Hannibal, studied his tactics, and ultimately defeated him using the Carthaginians' own methods. Hannibal, the undefeated tactical genius, had lost the war that mattered most because he could not control the strategic factors that determined victory. Both men understood that wars are not won by battles alone, but by the ability to sustain military effort over time, to maintain alliances, to command resources. Rome could do this. Carthage ultimately could not. Masinissa outlived both of them by 35 years. He ruled Numidia until 148 BC, dying at 90 in the full exercise of power. Among the three men whose decisions shaped Zama and its aftermath, he was the most successful in conventional terms. He achieved his goals, maintained his power throughout his life, died peacefully, and left behind a prosperous kingdom. Yet his historical reputation is more ambiguous than either Scipio's or Hannibal's. Scipio is remembered as a great Roman general who learned from his enemy and saved Rome. Hannibal is remembered as a tactical genius, one of the greatest military commanders in history, whose brilliance nearly destroyed Rome. Masinissa is remembered primarily for his betrayal, for switching sides at the crucial moment. His long reign, his accomplishments in building Numidia, his military skill, all of these tend to be overshadowed by the simple fact that he betrayed Carthage, and the betrayal changed history. This is perhaps unfair to Masinissa. He made a strategic decision based on his assessment of where power was moving in the Mediterranean world. He was correct. Rome was going to win. By allying with Rome at the right moment, he secured his kingdom and his people's prosperity for more than half a century. From his perspective, and from the perspective of his people, it was absolutely the right decision. That historians remember him primarily as a traitor says more about how we romanticize loyalty and condemn pragmatism than it says about Masinissa's character or his effectiveness as a leader. The final decades of Masinissa's life were spent consolidating power, expanding Numidia's territory at Carthage's expense and watching as the Mediterranean world he had helped create took shape. He saw Rome defeat Macedon and dominate Greece. He saw the Eastern Kingdom submit to Roman power. He saw his former enemy, the city of Carthage, shrink to insignificance, while his kingdom grew prosperous. He must have reflected on the choice he made in 206 or 205 BC, when he allied with Scipio. Every year that followed validated that choice. Rome continued to rise. Carthage continued to decline. His kingdom flourished under Roman protection. By any practical measure, he had chosen wisely. Yet one wonders if he ever thought about Hannibal dying alone in exile in Bithynia, poisoning himself rather than face Roman captivity. Did Masinissa feel any regret that his decision had contributed to the fall of the man he had once fought alongside? Did he ever wonder if there had been another way, a path that would have preserved both Carthage and Numidia as independent powers? Or was he too much the realist to indulge in such speculation? The sources don't tell us. We know what Masinissa did. We can only guess at what he felt about it. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, 2 years after Masinissa's death, marked the final chapter in a story that began at Zama. Roman forces, commanded by Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, besieged the city for 3 years. The Carthaginians, who had disarmed as Rome demanded but then realized Rome intended to destroy them regardless, rebuilt their military capacity from nothing. They held out with desperate courage against impossible odds. When the Romans finally broke into the city, fighting continued street by street, house by house, for 6 more days. When it was over, the city was burned, the population enslaved, and according to legend, though this is disputed by modern historians, salt was sown into the ground so nothing would grow there. Whether or not the salt story is true, the thoroughness of Carthage's destruction was unprecedented. Rome wanted to ensure that Carthage would never rise again. They succeeded. The city that had once dominated the Western Mediterranean ceased to exist, except as a Roman colony rebuilt on the ruins decades later. The betrayal at Zama had made this possible. With Carthage defeated in 202 BC, deprived of its military capacity and shackled by treaty restrictions, it could not rebuild sufficiently to resist when Rome finally decided on complete destruction 56 years later. If Hannibal had won at Zama, if Masinissa's cavalry had fought for Carthage instead of Rome, Carthage might have retained enough strength to either defeat Rome entirely or at least force a more equitable peace that preserved Carthaginian power. But that is not what happened. The Numidian cavalry charged into Hannibal's rear at Zama. Carthage lost, Rome won, and history flowed from that moment into the channels we know: the rise of Rome, the dominance of Latin culture, the shape of Western civilization, all of it made possible by what happened on that plain in Tunisia in 202 BC. The long shadow of Zama extended even into the modern era. When French colonialism brought North Africa under European control in the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial authorities often invoked ancient history to justify their presence. They portrayed themselves as successors to Rome, bringing civilization to the region. Numidian and Berber peoples were sometimes presented as natural allies of European powers, continuing the pattern established by Masinissa's alliance with Scipio. This was, of course, a self-serving interpretation that ignored the complex realities of both ancient and modern North Africa. But it shows how the events of Zama continued to echo through history, used and misused by later generations for their own purposes. Modern Algerian and Tunisian historians have re-examined Masinissa's legacy, sometimes celebrating him as a leader who unified Numidia and created a powerful kingdom, sometimes criticizing him for betraying Carthage and facilitating Roman domination. There is no consensus because the question of whether Masinissa made the right choice depends on what values you prioritize. If you prioritize pragmatic success, security, and prosperity for his people, then Masinissa made the right choice. If you prioritize loyalty, resistance to imperial domination, and long-term independence, then his betrayal was a catastrophic mistake. Both perspectives contain truth. The story of Zama and Masinissa's role in it remains contested ground, politically and emotionally charged even 2,200 years later. What remains indisputable is the magnitude of what happened at Zama and the role that Numidian cavalry played in determining the outcome. A battle that lasted perhaps a few hours on a plain in North Africa in 232 BC shaped the next 2 millennia of history. The defeat of Hannibal, the destruction of Carthage, the rise of Rome, the spread of Latin culture and Roman institutions, the foundation of Western civilization as we know it, all of these trace back to that moment when Masinissa chose Rome over Carthage, and his cavalry charged into the rear of Hannibal's army. Individual decisions by individual leaders, made for personal and political reasons in specific historical moments, can ripple forward through time with consequences that dwarf the original decision. Masinissa decided he would rather be a client king under Rome than risk defeat by remaining loyal to a weakening Carthage. That decision changed the world.